Eleanor Grayson, a frail widow, stood trembling at the bank counter, clutching her last savings as the staff sneered at her pleas for help. Her quiet dignity was met with cold contempt, until Keanu Reeves stepped out from the crowd and did something that left everyone frozen in shock, unraveling a horrifying truth buried deep within the bank's walls. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. If you love gripping tales like this, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got another incredible story waiting for you. It was a busy Tuesday afternoon at the downtown bank branch. Long lines stretched from the teller windows to the door, filled with restless customers muttering complaints under their breath. The steady clack of keyboards from behind the counters cut through the low buzz of voices, creating a tense, impatient vibe. Everyone seemed in a hurry. Everyone except Eleanor Grayson, a 73-year-old widow standing quietly in the corner. Her thin hands clutched a worn brown envelope, fingers trembling slightly as she waited. She didn't belong in this rush, not with her frayed wool coat and silver hair pulled into a tight bun, but she had to be here. Eleanor lived alone, scraping by on the small pension her husband left her when he passed 10 years ago. She was careful with every penny, budgeting it out for bills, groceries, and the occasional repair to her run-down house on the edge of town. That pension was her lifeline, the only thing keeping her afloat. But last week she'd checked her account and found a shock. A random fee, almost $50, had wiped out what little she had left. To her, it wasn't just a number. It was food on the table, pills for her blood pressure, a thin thread of security in a life that felt more fragile every day. She didn't know why the charge had appeared, but she couldn't let it slide. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Standing there, her legs ached from over an hour of waiting. She'd been in line so long her feet felt numb, but she didn't dare sit down. Losing her spot wasn't an option. She glanced around, hoping for a kind face, someone who might care enough to listen. But the staff behind the counters barely looked up, their eyes skipping over her like she wasn't even there. They moved fast, shuffling papers and typing away, focused on everyone but her. Eleanor clutched the envelope tighter, her heart sinking. She whispered to herself, so quiet it was almost a thought. "I've got to fix this today. They have to hear me out." But the words felt hollow, drowned by the noise of the crowd. She wasn't used to places like this. Big, busy, and cold. Back when her husband was alive, he'd handled the banking, leaving her free to tend their home. Now, alone and out of her depth, she felt like a stranger in a world that didn't want her. That $50 fee wasn't just a mistake, it was a threat. A crack in the frail wall she'd built around her life. She had no one to turn to, no one to call, no kids, no friends close enough to help. All she had was that envelope and a stubborn flicker of hope that someone, anyone, would care. In that packed bank, surrounded by indifference, Eleanor was invisible, until the moment everything shifted. Eleanor Grayson had waited over an hour in the crowded bank, her legs aching and her hands tight around that worn brown envelope. The steady hum of complaints and the clack of keyboards filled the air, but she'd finally reached the front of the line. She stepped up to the counter, her heart thudding with a mix of hope and dread. Behind the glass sat Lisa Carter, a young teller in her mid-20s with dark circles under her eyes and a pinched expression that screamed exhaustion. Her fingers moved fast over the keyboard, her gaze fixed on the screen like she was on autopilot. Eleanor cleared her throat softly, clutching the envelope closer. "Excuse me, miss," she started, her voice shaky but polite. I need help with something in my account. Lisa didn't look up right away. She finished typing, hit a key with a sharp tap, and then flicked her eyes to Eleanor, barely hiding her impatience. "Yeah, what's the problem?" she asked, her tone flat, like she'd already heard every story in the book. Eleanor slid the envelope under the glass, her fingers trembling as she opened it to reveal a crumpled bank statement. "There's a fee here, almost $50, she said, pointing at the line with a shaky finger. "It showed up last week, and I don't know why. It's taken almost everything I have left." Her voice cracked on that last part, betraying the panic she'd been holding in. Lisa sighed, a short, sharp sound that cut through Eleanor's words like a knife. She grabbed the statement, gave it a quick glance, and slid it back without a second thought. "That's a standard maintenance fee, ma'am," she said, her voice dripping with boredom. "It's in the account terms. Happens all the time." She turned back to her screen, already dismissing Eleanor. But Eleanor wasn't ready to give up. "No, wait," she said, leaning closer to the glass. "I've never had this before. I can't afford it. I live on my pension, and this is everything I've got." Her words stumbled out, desperate but earnest. Lisa rolled her eyes, not even trying to hide it. "Look, lady," she snapped, cutting Eleanor off mid-sentence. "If you don't get how banks work these days, that's not my problem. Fees are fees. You signed up for the account, you deal with it." Her tone was sharp now, edged with mockery. Like Eleanor was some clueless relic who didn't belong in the modern world. Eleanor's face flushed, a mix of shame and frustration burning in her chest. "But I didn't sign up for this," she insisted, her voice rising just a little. "I just want someone to check it. Please." She pushed the statement back toward Lisa, her hand shaking harder now. Lisa didn't touch it. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with a smirk. "There's nothing to check. It's in the system. Automatic. Maybe if you kept more money in there, you wouldn't get hit with stuff like this." The words landed like a slap, cold and cruel. Eleanor froze, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. Before she could find her voice, a shadow fell over the counter. Greg Sullivan, the branch manager, strode up behind Lisa, his polished shoes clicking on the tile. He was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with a slicked-back haircut and an air of arrogance that filled the space. "What's going on here?" he barked, arms crossed, his eyes darting from Lisa to Eleanor. Lisa straightened up, tossing Eleanor a quick, nervous glance. "Just a customer who doesn't get the account policies, sir," she said, her smirk fading into something more cautious. Greg turned his gaze on Eleanor, sizing her up like she was an inconvenience he'd rather squash than solve. "I think there's a mistake," Eleanor said, her voice small but steady. "This fee, it's not right. I just need it looked at." Greg let out a short, mocking laugh, loud enough to draw a few heads from the line behind her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone thick with condescension, "if you can't afford the fees, maybe this bank isn't for you. We don't hand out charity here." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The words hit harder than Lisa's snark, stripping away what little dignity she'd clung to. She felt the eyes of the crowd on her now, some curious, some indifferent, all judging. Her hands gripped the counter's edge, knuckles white, as humiliation washed over her. She wanted to argue, to fight back, but her voice wouldn't come. Greg smirked, already turning away, while Lisa tapped her keyboard like nothing had happened. Eleanor stood there, alone and powerless, the weight of their scorn pressing down on her frail shoulders. She was nothing to them, just an old woman with an empty account. until something shifted in the air behind her. Eleanor Grayson stood frozen at the counter, Greg Sullivan's mocking words, "Maybe this bank isn't for you," still ringing in her ears. Her hands shook on the edge of the counter, the weight of humiliation pinning her in place as Lisa Carter tapped away at her keyboard, indifferent to the scene she'd helped create. The murmurs of the crowd behind her felt like a spotlight, every whisper a jab at her fragile pride. Greg had already turned to walk away, his smirk signaling the end of the conversation, or so he thought. Then, a calm voice cut through the air, steady and firm, stopping him cold. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The bank fell silent. The clatter of keyboards paused, the rustle of papers stilled, and every head turned toward the sound. A man stepped forward from the line, his figure unremarkable at first glance. Just a guy in a faded jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He'd been there the whole time, blending into the crowd, watching quietly as Eleanor's pleas were brushed off. But now, he moved with purpose, his boots scuffing the tile as he closed the distance to the counter. Greg spun around, irritation flashing across his face. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, crossing his arms. The man didn't flinch. He just tilted his head slightly and reached up, tugging the cap off his head. A ripple of gasps spread through the room. Dark hair fell across his forehead, framing a face everyone knew but no one expected to see here. Keanu Reeves, the Keanu Reeves, stood there, his expression calm but his eyes locked on Greg with an intensity that made the manager shift uncomfortably. The crowd buzzed, whispers turning into stunned murmurs. "Is that? No way, it's him!" Eleanor blinked, her breath catching as she stared at the man who'd just spoken up for her. She'd seen him in movies, sure, but this was different. Real, raw, and right in front of her. Voice low but carrying a weight that filled the silence. "Why are you talking to her like that? She's asking for help, and you're laughing at her." Greg opened his mouth, then closed it, caught off guard by the quiet authority in Keanu's tone. Lisa glanced up from her screen, her smugness fading into unease as she realized who she was dealing with. "Mr. Reeves," Greg finally managed, forcing a tight smile. "I didn't know you were here. This is just a customer issue. Nothing to worry about." Keanu didn't buy it. He stepped closer, nodding toward Eleanor. "Doesn't look like nothing to me. She's got a problem, and you're making it worse." He turned to Eleanor, softening his voice. "Ma'am, can I see what's going on?" Eleanor hesitated, still dazed, but slid the envelope across the counter with a shaky hand. "It's this fee," she said, barely above a whisper. "It's taken everything I have." Keanu took the papers gently, his brow furrowing as he scanned the statement. His eyes narrowed at the line she'd pointed out, the $50 charge that had sparked all this. He held the paper up, turning back to Greg. "This doesn't look right," he said, his tone sharpening. "Fees don't just pop up out of nowhere, not like this. What's the deal?" Greg shifted his weight, his confidence cracking. "It's standard," he said, echoing Lisa's earlier line, but his voice wavered. Lisa piped up, her words rushed. "Yeah, it's in the system, automatic." Keanu shook his head, cutting through their excuses. "Automatic doesn't mean fair. You're telling me you can't even check it?" He set the statement down, fixing Greg with a steady gaze. "She deserves better than this. So do an explanation. Now." The room held its breath, waiting for what came next. Keanu Reeves stood at the counter, the crumpled bank statement still in his hand, his eyes boring into Greg Sullivan. The manager's smug grin had vanished, replaced by a twitchy unease as the weight of Keanu's presence pressed down on him. Eleanor Grayson watched, her breath shallow, as this stranger, this movie star, held her fragile hope in his steady grip. Keanu tapped the paper with a finger, his voice calm but cutting. This fee, $50 out of nowhere. You're saying it's standard, but it doesn't add up. People don't just lose their last dime to standard. He leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. So what's really going on here? Greg adjusted his tie, a nervous tick, and forced a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. It's just a glitch, Mr. Reeves, he said, his words tripping over each other. A system error happens sometimes. We'll get it sorted. But Keanu wasn't buying the dodge. He'd seen too many half-truths in his life to let this slide. He shook his head, slow and deliberate. A glitch doesn't wipe out someone's account like this, not unless it's meant to. He set the statement down, crossing his arms. You've got access to the system right there. Pull it up. Let's see what's behind this error. His tone left no room for argument. Greg hesitated, his eyes darting to Lisa Carter, who'd gone pale behind the counter. She fumbled with her keyboard, her earlier snark replaced by a jittery silence. Do it, Keanu said, his voice firm but not loud, the kind of quiet that carried more weight than a shout. Greg swallowed hard, then nodded at Lisa. Check her account, he muttered, stepping back like he could distance himself from whatever came next. Lisa's fingers flew over the keys, the screen flickering as she pulled up Eleanor's file. The room stayed quiet, the crowd leaning in, sensing something big brewing. Eleanor clutched her coat, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to expect, but she trusted this man who'd stepped in for her. Keanu watched the screen over Lisa's shoulder, his brow furrowing as the numbers loaded. Wait, he said, pointing at a line. That's not just one fee, there's 3 in the last 2 months. $10, 15, now 50, all labeled maintenance. He turned to Greg, his voice sharpening. This isn't random. It's a pattern. Greg opened his mouth, but Keanu cut him off. Don't tell me it's a glitch again. You don't hit the same account over and over by accident. He glanced at Eleanor, softening for a second. She's on a pension, barely scraping by. Who else is getting slammed like this? Greg's face tightened, sweat beading on his forehead. I don't know, he stammered. It's just her account, probably. A one-off? But Keanu wasn't letting it go. Pull the records, he said, nodding at the computer. All accounts with these fees. Now. Lisa hesitated, shooting Greg a panicked look, but he waved her on, his hands shaky. The screen shifted, rows of data scrolling past. Names, dates, charges. Keanu's eyes scanned the list, and his jaw clenched. Look at this, he said, his voice low and tight. 75-year-old, 82, 69. All small accounts, all hit with the same fees, hundreds of them. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock spreading through the bank. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling up as the truth sank in. She wasn't alone. Greg stumbled back, his excuses crumbling. It's not what you think, he said, his voice cracking. The system it flags low balance accounts. That's all. Keanu's eyes narrowed. Flags them for what? To bleed them dry? He pointed at the screen. This isn't a mistake. It's targeted. Older folks. People who don't check online. Who don't fight back. He turned to Eleanor. People like her. Lisa broke, her voice trembling as she blurted out, It's not us. It's from upstairs. Greg whipped around, hissing, Shut up. But it was too late. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Keanu zeroed in on her. Upstairs? Who? Lisa shrank under his gaze, her hands twisting together. The, the regional office, she whispered. They told us to push the fees. Said it'd boost profits. Cover some shortfall. We just followed orders. The bank went dead silent, every eye on her. Greg's face drained of color, his authority gone. Eleanor stared, her mind reeling. Hundreds of people like her, cheated out of what little they had. Keanu set the statement down, his calm masking a growing fire. So it's a scheme, he said, locking eyes with Greg. Not an error, a plan. How many lives have you wrecked for a few extra bucks? Greg couldn't answer, his mouth working soundlessly. The truth was out now, ugly and raw, and Keanu wasn't done digging. The air in the bank was thick with tension. Lisa Carter's confession, "It's from upstairs," still echoing in the stunned silence. Keanu Reeves stood firm at the counter, the crumpled bank statement in one hand, his eyes burning into Greg Sullivan. The manager's face was ashen, sweat glistening on his brow as the weight of the exposed scheme crushed his flimsy defenses. Eleanor Grayson clutched her coat, her mind spinning with the revelation that she wasn't the only victim, that hundreds of others had been preyed on too. Keanu didn't flinch, his calm voice slicing through the hush. You've been stealing from people who can't fight back. That ends now. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for everyone to see. The crowd shifted, a murmur rippling through as he tapped the screen and started recording. This is happening right now at a bank downtown, he said, his tone steady but fierce, the camera sweeping from Greg's panicked face to Lisa's trembling hands. They've been hitting elderly customers with hidden fees. Not just one person, but hundreds. This isn't a mistake. It's a plan to squeeze every cent out of people who can't afford it. He turned the lens toward Eleanor, softening for a moment. People like her, who deserve better. Then back to Greg. And they're admitting it's orders from the top. Greg lunged forward, hands outstretched like he could snatch the phone away. Wait, please, Mr. Reeves, don't do this! His voice cracked, desperation spilling out. We can fix it, I swear. We'll refund her right now, no questions asked. He waved frantically at Lisa, who fumbled with the keyboard, her fingers slipping as she tried to pull up Eleanor's account again. See? We're making it right. There's no need for this to go further. His eyes darted around, pleading with Keanu, then the crowd, as if he could convince them to unhear the truth. But Keanu didn't lower the phone. Fixing it now doesn't erase what you've done, he said, his voice cold. How many people didn't come in today? How many never got the chance to fight? Greg's shoulders slumped, his hands dropping to his sides. I didn't want this, he stammered, barely audible. It was the regional office. They pushed us to hit quotas. Lisa nodded, her face flushed with guilt. They said it was temporary, just to cover some losses. Keanu shook his head, the camera still rolling. Temporary for you, permanent for them, he shot back, nodding toward Eleanor. You don't get to play innocent when you're the ones cashing the checks. He stopped recording, slipping the phone into his pocket, but his next move sent a jolt through the room. He pulled it out again, dialed a number, and put it to his ear. Hey, Mike, Keanu said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. Yeah, it's me. I'm at a bank downtown. Caught them running a scam on elderly accounts. Hundreds hit with fees they can't explain. I've got it on video, and they're admitting it's from higher up. Can you take a look? He paused, listening, then nodded. Great. I'll send it over. Thanks, man. He hung up, turning back to Greg, who looked like he'd been punched. "That was a friend of mine, a lawyer. He'll make sure this doesn't just disappear." The crowd erupted in whispers, some pulling out their own phones, the story already spreading. Eleanor watched it all unfold, her heart racing in a way it hadn't in years. At first, she'd felt small, crushed by Greg's scorn and Lisa's snark. But now, with Keanu standing there, fighting for her, for all of them, something shifted. She straightened up a little, her hands loosening on her coat. She wasn't used to this. Someone caring enough to step in, let alone a man she'd only known from movie screens. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky but stronger than before. Keanu glanced at her, offering a small, reassuring nod. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "This shouldn't have happened to you." But beneath her gratitude, a knot of worry tightened in her chest. What would come next? Would the bank retaliate? Could they really fix this? Or was it too late for the others who'd been hurt? She looked at Keanu, his calm resolve a lifeline in the chaos, and felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at her. Greg slumped against the counter, muttering promises to sort it out, while Lisa stared at the floor, her bravado gone. Keanu stood tall, his presence a quiet storm, and Eleanor knew this was far from over. Keanu Reeves stood at the counter, his phone back in his pocket after calling his lawyer friend, his eyes still fixed on Greg Sullivan. The manager, now a jittery wreck, barked at Lisa Carter to pull up Eleanor Grayson's account and reverse the fees. "Do it now! Fix it!" he snapped, his voice trembling as he tried to claw back some control. Lisa typed frantically, the screen flickering with data, her hands shaking as the crowd watched in tense silence. Eleanor stood beside Keanu, her frail frame steadier now, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over her as the refund processed. But before anyone could breathe easy, a voice broke through from the back of the line. "Hold up, I've got those fees too, and I'm not even old." Every head turned. A man stepped forward, mid-40s, dressed in a plain button-up and jeans. Nothing flashy, just another face in the crowd until now. He adjusted his glasses, his expression sharp and unflinching. "Name's Paul Kendrick," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "I've been hit with the same charges, $15 last month, 20 this one. Thought it was a fluke till I heard all this." Murmurs rippled through the bank, confusion turning to curiosity. Keanu raised an eyebrow, sizing him up. "You're not elderly," he said, stating the obvious. Paul nodded, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Exactly. Which means it's not just them." He pointed at Eleanor. "It's bigger." Greg froze, his mouth half open, while Lisa's hands hovered over the keyboard. Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recorder, holding it up like a trophy. "I've been taping this whole thing," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "And I've got more. Emails, memos, straight from an insider at this bank. It's not these two clowns calling the shots." He nodded toward Greg and Lisa, who flinched. "It's the bigwigs upstairs, the regional execs. They cooked up this fee scam to plug a massive financial hole. Millions in losses they didn't want anyone to see." The room erupted in gasps, phones snapping up to capture the moment. Keanu blinked, caught off guard for the first time. He'd walked in to help one woman and stumbled into a full-blown exposé. "You're a reporter," he said, piecing it together. Paul grinned, a glint in his eye. "Investigative journalist. Been tailing this bank for months. You just lit the match I needed." Eleanor stared, her hands clutching her coat tighter, the scope of it all sinking in. Greg stammered, That's not true. But Paul cut him off. Save it. I've got names, dates, enough to bury this place. He turned to Keanu. Thanks for blowing it wide open, man. I'll take it from here. Keanu let out a small, surprised laugh, shaking his head. Guess I'm just the warm-up act, he said, handing Eleanor her bank statement with a gentle nod. You're in good hands now, ma'am. She looked up at him, eyes misty. I don't know what to say, she whispered. He smiled, soft and genuine. You don't have to. With that, he stepped back, slipping through the crowd as Paul took center stage, already talking to the growing swarm of onlookers. Keanu slipped out the door, leaving Eleanor and the journalist to face the chaos. The bank wasn't just staring down a lawsuit. It was teetering on collapse, its dirty laundry aired for all to see. In the days that followed, the bank unraveled. A full-blown investigation tore through its records, exposing the regional execs who'd orchestrated the fee scam to mask their losses. They faced charges, their careers and the bank itself crumbling under the weight of the scandal. Victims, hundreds of them, got their money back, not because of Keanu's video, which stayed in his pocket, but thanks to Paul Kendrick's bombshell article. It hit the news like a freight train, proving one voice could spark a reckoning. Eleanor Grayson walked away with more than a refund. She became a quiet symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the overlooked can stand tall. Keanu? He faded back into the crowd, just a passerby who'd opened a door. Sometimes a hero isn't the one who finishes the fight, but the one who cracks the silence, letting truth rush in. Life's full of Eleanors, people dismissed until someone listens, and Keanu shows us that a small act can ripple into justice. What about you? Ever been overcharged or ignored by a system that didn't care? Drop a comment below. Let's hear your story. Life's messy, but speaking up can change it.